Tonight's story is the result of many hours of thoughtful research and silent commitment. Every detail has been chosen intentionally to create a calm listening experience and to honor the stories being shared. This channel exists to give voice to cases that history nearly forgot. The fluorescent lights on Ward 3A never really turned off. They dimmed at midnight, casting the hospital corridor in a pale half-light that was neither day nor night. In that in-between space, the overnight shift moved through its routines. Vital signs checked, medications charted, patients sleeping or trying to, and in one of those rooms, someone sat at a bedside waiting. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. This evening, we uncover disturbing cases where the truth lurked far beneath a harmless surface. Now, please take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story The Night Shift, the Retta Mays case. Now let's begin. Between July 2017 and June 2018, something began happening on the third floor of the Lewis A. Johnson Veterans Medical Center in Clarksburg, West Virginia. Elderly patients, some recovering from strokes or heart conditions, would suffer sudden drops in blood sugar, seizures, confusion, coma, death. The medical staff couldn't understand why it kept happening. These weren't diabetic crises in patients who needed insulin. These were unexplained events in people who had been stable, expected to recover and go home. Please, if you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. The pattern took almost a year to see. When it finally emerged, investigators discovered that all of these episodes had occurred during the overnight shift, and one person had been present for every single one. This is the story of what happened when trust became a weapon. Clarksburg, West Virginia, sits in the northern part of the state, a small city of roughly 18,000 people surrounded by the forested hills of Appalachia. It's a place where everyone knows someone who served, where the local economy has shifted over decades from coal and industry to healthcare and government services. The Lewis A. Johnson VA Medical Center sits on a 16-acre campus adjacent to Veterans Memorial Park, a quiet facility that opened in December 1950, named for the former Secretary of Defense who once practiced law in Clarksburg before serving in World War I. The medical center serves approximately 70,000 veterans across north-central West Virginia and neighboring counties in Maryland, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. It's a teaching hospital affiliated with West Virginia University, providing primary care and specialty services to men and women who served in Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, and conflicts stretching back to World War II. For many of these veterans, the hospital represents a promise kept, a covenant between citizen and country. In June 2015, Retta Phyllis Mays began working at the medical center as a nursing assistant. She was 40 years old, born and raised in nearby Reynoldsville. Her employment application listed previous work as a correctional officer at the North Central Regional Jail, a position she had held from 2005 to 2012. What the application didn't fully disclose was the extent of her qualifications, or lack thereof. Mays had no certification or license to care for patients. As a nursing assistant, her role was to provide basic care: bathing, feeding, monitoring vital signs, transporting patients. She was not qualified or authorized to administer any medication. Mays was a veteran herself. She had served in the West Virginia Army National Guard, deploying to Iraq and Kuwait in 2003 with the 1092nd Engineer Battalion as a chemical equipment repairer. Those who served with her described someone unremarkable, competent enough, someone they would never have suspected of anything unusual. One colleague who deployed with her would later tell reporters he never would have dreamed she was capable of what eventually came to light. "This is Jekyll and Hyde if I ever did see it," he said. Before joining the National Guard, and before her work at the jail, Mays had been a longtime member of Monroe Chapel United Methodist, a small church about 20 minutes outside Clarksburg in Lost Creek. She had a family. She had a life that, from the outside, appeared ordinary. But beneath that surface, there were fractures that few people saw. Her husband, Gordon Mays, had been convicted in 2012 of accessing child pornography. He would later serve time for failing to register as a sex offender. During the period when Retta Mays was working at the VA hospital, Gordon was incarcerated. She would call him almost every morning after her overnight shift. Conversations that lasted hours, conversations that investigators would later listen to with growing alarm. In 2013, Mays had been named as a defendant in a lawsuit filed by an inmate at the North Central Regional Jail. The inmate alleged that Mays and other correctional officers had repeatedly beaten him. The lawsuit included claims that Mays had kicked him, spit in his face, and used profane language while he was restrained. The case was eventually dismissed on summary judgment, but it painted a picture of someone willing to use force, someone who had crossed lines before. When Mays started at the VA hospital, these details were either unknown or overlooked. A federal background investigation would later reveal what the hospital called potentially actionable issues that may have been disqualifying under suitability and security considerations. But those findings were never properly reviewed. In 2017, when Mays received an award for being an exemplary employee, another background check should have been initiated under VA policy. It wasn't. She worked the night shift, Ward 3A, the medical surgical unit. The hours when staffing was thin, when supervision was minimal, when the hospital settled into its quietest rhythm. Mays checked vital signs, measured blood glucose levels, sat with patients who needed monitoring. She had access to the medication room. She had access to medication carts. So did everyone else on the ward. Security was lax. Insulin, a powerful hormone that lowers blood sugar, was stored in unlocked carts and medication rooms that staff entered and exited freely. No one was watching closely enough to notice when something started to go wrong. In July 2017, elderly patients on Ward 3A began experiencing acute drops in blood sugar. Hypoglycemia, readings that plunged to dangerously low levels, causing confusion, seizures, loss of consciousness. For non-diabetic patients, this was baffling. For diabetic patients whose insulin doses were carefully controlled, it was equally inexplicable. The medical staff would respond quickly, administering glucose to counteract the crisis, stabilizing the patient. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. Sometimes the patient would stabilize only to crash again hours later. Robert Edge Sr., an 82-year-old Navy veteran who had served from 1952 to 1956, died on July 20, 2017. The official cause was attributed to complications from his existing medical conditions, but his death was the first in what would become a pattern. Over the next 11 months, the deaths continued. Robert Kozel, an 89-year-old Army veteran, died on January 29, 2018. Archie Edgel, an 84-year-old Korean War veteran who had served in Germany and played in the Army Band, suffered a severe drop in blood sugar to a reading of 24. Normal blood sugar ranges between 70 and 100. Anything below 70 is low. Anything below 40 is life-threatening. Staff stabilized Edgel, bringing his levels back up. Then, a short time later, his blood sugar plummeted again. He died on March 25, 2018. An autopsy would later reveal that he had been injected with insulin 4 times. George Nelson Shaw Sr., an 81-year-old Air Force veteran, died on April 10, 2018. William Holloway, a 96-year-old Army veteran who had served in World War II, died on April 4, 2018. Felix McDermott, an 82-year-old Army veteran, died on April 9, 2018, for deaths in 16 days. The medical center staff began to notice. These were not patients in hospice care, not people on the edge of death. These were elderly men with manageable conditions, men who had been expected to recover and return home. The common thread was hypoglycemia. The hospital began an internal investigation, examining 11 deaths that had occurred under similar circumstances. All of them had happened on Ward 3A. All of them had happened during the overnight shift. And all of them had happened when Retta Mays was on duty. In June 2018, Raymond Golden, an 88-year-old veteran who had served in both the Army and Air Force, died after a hypoglycemic episode. Another patient, Russell Posey Sr., a 92-year-old Navy veteran, suffered a severe drop in blood sugar but survived the initial crisis. He would die 2 weeks later from complications. By this time, the hospital had seen enough. A doctor reported concerns to the VA Inspector General's office, noting the suspicious pattern of deaths from unexplained hypoglycemia, including deaths of non-diabetic patients. The Inspector General opened a criminal investigation. In July 2018, Retta Mays was removed from patient care. She was not arrested. She was not immediately fired. She continued to work in a non-patient-facing role while the investigation unfolded. She was questioned. She denied any involvement. She appeared shocked, upset, confused that anyone would suspect her. She cried during that first interview, talking about how hard she worked, how much she cared about the patients, how terrible it was that these things had happened on her watch. The investigators began the painstaking work of building a case without direct evidence. There were no cameras in patient rooms. There were no eyewitnesses. There were no syringes with her fingerprints left behind in the trash. What they had was circumstantial, but it was damning. They reviewed thousands of pages of medical records. They exhumed bodies for autopsies. They consulted with forensic experts and endocrinologists. They interviewed more than 300 people. They reviewed hospital staff schedules and visitor logs. They analyzed phone records, social media accounts, computer searches, and they listened to hundreds of hours of phone calls that Retta Mays had made to her husband in jail. The voice on the recorded line was tired, frustrated, sometimes angry. Retta Mays called her husband Gordon almost every morning after her overnight shift ended. She talked about work, about the patients, about how difficult everything had become. In one call, she complained about having to sit one-on-one with a patient, monitoring them through the night. At 4 o'clock in the morning, I had to take over sitting in one of the one-on-ones so one of the other aides could go out and work on the floor, she said, her voice tight with irritation. And the one I was sitting with I wanted to freaking strangle. Investigators noted the date and time of that call. It had been made the morning after one of the hypoglycemic episodes. In another call, Mays complained to Gordon about her arms being sore from doing chest compressions on a patient during a medical emergency. She described the patient as someone with no quality of life, someone suffering. If the staff had just marked him as DNR, do not resuscitate, she told her husband, the patient would have went to sleep when his sugar dropped down to 30. She sounded exhausted. She sounded like someone who believed she was doing something merciful. The investigators also examined May's internet search history. In the months following the first death, she had searched for information about female serial killers. She had watched a Netflix series called Nurses Who Kill. One episode focused specifically on healthcare workers who had murdered patients using insulin. The timing was significant. The searches began after the pattern of deaths had started, as though Mays was trying to understand what she had become, or perhaps looking for company in the dark territory she had entered. The forensic evidence told its own story. When bodies were exhumed and autopsies performed, pathologists found elevated levels of C-peptide, a substance produced when the body naturally creates insulin. But these patients also showed the presence of exogenous insulin, insulin that had come from outside their bodies, injected rather than produced. For non-diabetic patients, there was no medical reason for insulin to be in their systems at all. For diabetic patients, the amounts found were far beyond what had been prescribed. The pathologists ruled out other potential causes for the hypoglycemia: tumors that produce insulin, organ failure, medication interactions. None of these explained the sudden, severe drops in blood sugar that occurred in the middle of the night, drops that would briefly stabilize and then plummet again as though someone had administered a second dose. May's work schedule became a focal point. Every suspicious death, every unexplained hypoglycemic event, had occurred during her shift. When she was assigned to a patient's room, that patient was at risk. When she was moved off Ward 3A in July 2018, the death stopped. Completely. Not a single suspicious hypoglycemic episode occurred after her removal. The hospital had failed in multiple ways. The medication rooms and carts were unsecured, accessible to anyone on the ward, not just licensed nurses. Insulin vials sat in plain view, easy to take, easy to use. There were no systems in place to track who accessed medications or when. The culture of the facility, as the VA Inspector General would later conclude, did not consistently promote patient safety. A combination of clinical and administrative failures had created the conditions that allowed Mays to commit these acts and for them to go undetected for so long. In October 2019, investigators brought Mays in for a second interview. This one lasted 5 hours. It was conducted by a special agent from the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, someone trained in the psychology of interrogation, someone who understood how to read the silences between words. Mays sat across the table, still denying involvement, still insisting she didn't know what had happened to these patients, still presenting herself as a caregiver who had done her best under difficult circumstances. But the agent pressed. He walked her through the evidence. The phone calls, the internet searches, the work schedules, the pattern that connected every death to her presence. He asked her what she was leaving out, what she was omitting that made her feel the way she did. Mays cried. She said she wasn't omitting anything, that she hadn't done anything wrong, that she didn't know of anyone who had. The interview ended without a confession, but the agent felt something shift. Mays knew the walls were closing in. By autumn 2019, prosecutors and investigators had identified a person of interest, though they didn't publicly name anyone. Behind the scenes, everyone involved knew that Retta Mays had been the focus from the beginning. The evidence was circumstantial but overwhelming. The challenge was that without a confession, without direct physical evidence tying her to specific syringes or vials, the case would be difficult to prosecute beyond a reasonable doubt. The investigation had revealed approximately 20 suspicious deaths during the time Mays worked at the hospital. But prosecutors were conservative, bringing charges only in cases where they believed the evidence was sufficient to prove, even without a confession, that Mays had intentionally caused death. 8 cases met that standard. 7 murders. 1 assault with intent to commit murder. In early 2020, as the investigation neared its conclusion, Mays made a decision that surprised even her family. She went to the courthouse in Clarksburg and applied for a court-appointed attorney. She had not yet been charged with a crime. She had not been arrested, but she knew what was coming. On July 14, 2020, Retta Mays appeared in the United States District Court for the Northern District of West Virginia in Clarksburg. She pleaded guilty to 7 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of assault with intent to commit murder. She waived her right to have the case presented to a grand jury. She admitted in open court that she had murdered the patients. She wept as the details of the charges were read aloud. The courtroom was quiet except for the sound of her crying. The families of the victims sat in the gallery, watching the woman who had taken their loved ones. Some of them had talked to Mays during their father's or husband's hospitalizations. She had seemed kind, concerned, professional. She had sat with their dying relatives, listening as doctors fought to stabilize blood sugar levels, watching as organs began to shut down. She had been there in the room when family members said goodbye, and she had been the one who caused it all. No one could quite articulate why. That was the question that hung over everything. Why would a nursing assistant, a veteran who had served her country, a church member, a grandmother, why would she do this? The courtroom waited for an answer that made sense, something that could organize the horror into a comprehensible narrative. Retta Mays stood before the judge and offered what explanation she could. She said she had administered insulin to patients because she believed they were suffering, because she wanted them to pass gently. It was a claim often made by so-called angels of mercy, healthcare workers who kill patients under the guise of compassion. Investigators had heard it before. The problem was that none of the victims fit that profile. Robert Edge Sr. had been recovering from a treatable condition. Robert Kozel had been expected to go home. Archie Edgell had been stable before his first hypoglycemic episode. George Shaw, William Holloway, Felix McDermott, Raymond Golden, None of them had been in hospice care. None of them had been on the edge of death. They were elderly, yes. They had health issues, yes. But they were not suffering unbearably. They were not beyond medical help. They were men who had families waiting for them to come home. Mays also said that she had experienced a lot of stress and chaos in her personal and professional life, and that her actions gave her a sense of control. This explanation felt closer to the truth. Her husband was in jail for child pornography. Her work history included allegations of excessive force. She had mental health struggles, a documented history of depression and anxiety, treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. In May 2016, a patient had punched her in the face, knocking her unconscious, sending her to the emergency room. She had returned to work afterward, but something had shifted. Her attorney, Jay McCamick, described her long history of mental health issues, medical problems, the incident with the patient who assaulted her. He told the court that many people wanted a linear story, a unified motive that explained why someone would set upon the idea of taking the life of others and go forward with that idea. But that answer wasn't available. Unfortunately, why is not a question that can be answered here, McCamick said. Retta doesn't know why. Her family doesn't know why. The judge, U.S. District Judge Thomas Klee, listened to all of this. He had presided over many cases involving defendants with mental health issues. He understood that trauma, depression, and PTSD could shape behavior in profound ways. But he also understood that not everyone with those struggles became a killer. You're not special, he told Mays. I see many defendants with mental health issues who aren't killers. Klee had reviewed the evidence. He knew that Mays had lied to investigators at least 3 times, denying any involvement even as the circumstantial case against her grew stronger. He knew that after she had injected her first victim, she had gone home and watched a Netflix series about nurses who kill. He knew that she had searched online for information about female serial killers, not out of academic curiosity, but as though looking for mirrors of herself. He knew about the phone calls to her husband, the casual way she had talked about wanting to strangle a patient, the complaint about having sore arms from doing compressions on someone she believed had no quality of life. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jared Douglas, addressed the court. He rejected the notion that May's actions were mercy killings. These men were not in need of mercy by the defendant, Douglas said. In the end, it wasn't the defendant's call to make. He described her behavior as predatory and planned, not reactionary. She had known where the insulin was kept. She had known how to access it without being noticed. She had known how to inject it in a way that would cause hypoglycemia. And she had known, after the first death, exactly what the result would be. Yet she had continued, 7 times. Before the sentencing, family members spoke. Becky Kozel, the daughter-in-law of Robert Kozel, stood and addressed Mays directly. You confessed to ruining 7 families by robbing us of our loved ones, she said. Why should you ever be allowed out of prison to enjoy freedom? Amanda Edgell, the daughter-in-law of Archie Edgell, spoke about the man they had lost. He was a Korean War veteran who had played in the army band. He had lived a full life. He had a family who loved him. We will forever miss him, she said. I will never understand why you, Mrs. Mays, decided to play God. Melanie Proctor, the daughter of Felix McDermott, held the cartridges from the 21-gun salute at her father's funeral. Her father had served in the army, had been a husband, a father, a grandfather. He had been taken from them not by age or illness, but by someone he had trusted to care for him. Mays addressed the court briefly. Her voice cracked. She shook. I know that there's no words that I can say that would alter the family's pain and comfort, she said. I don't ask for forgiveness because I don't think I could forgive anyone for doing what I did. On May 11, 2021, Judge Klee sentenced Retta Mays to 7 consecutive life sentences, 1 for each murder, plus 20 years for the assault with intent to commit murder. The consecutive nature of the sentences meant that even if she became eligible for parole on 1 life sentence, she would immediately begin serving the next. She would, in all likelihood, die in prison. You are the worst kind, Judge Klee told her. You're the monster that no one sees coming. The courtroom was silent. The families sat with the weight of it, knowing that justice had been served but that their loved ones were still gone. Some of them had died slowly, their organs shutting down over hours or days as the insulin worked through their systems. Some had been injected multiple times when the first dose didn't kill them quickly enough. Archie Edgell had been injected 4 times. He had crashed, been stabilized, crashed again, been stabilized again, and then crashed a final time before his body gave out. Investigators had learned that Mays would sometimes linger in the rooms after administering the insulin, sitting at the bedside, watching. She would listen to the doctors and nurses fighting to save the patient, to the conversations between medical staff and family members. She was there when the families said goodbye. An anonymous investigator told the Washington Post that Mays would watch her victims die a slow and painful death. In one case, when the first injection didn't work, she had returned and injected the patient again. The VA Inspector General's report, released after the sentencing, detailed the systemic failures that had allowed the murders to continue. The facility had not properly reviewed May's personnel records. They had not contacted her previous employers. They had not followed up on the federal background investigation that flagged potentially disqualifying issues. They had given her access to medications she should never have touched. They had left insulin unsecured in unlocked rooms and carts. They had failed to detect a pattern of suspicious deaths for nearly a year. The report made 15 recommendations spanning personnel hiring and evaluation, medication management and security, reporting and responding to unexplained events, quality and safety oversight, and computer systems for data analysis. The facility had not consistently promoted a culture that prioritized patient safety. The combination of clinical and administrative failures had created the conditions that allowed Mays to commit her crimes and for them to go undetected for so long. In July 2021, Retta Mays was transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution in Aliceville, Alabama, a low-security facility where she would serve her sentence. Judge Klee had recommended that she be placed at Federal Medical Center, Carswell, in Fort Worth, Texas, where she could receive ongoing mental health treatment. The Bureau of Prisons assigned her to Aliceville instead. She is currently 50 years old. If she serves her full sentence, she will die there. The Lewis A. Johnson VA Medical Center began implementing the Inspector General's recommendations. Security protocols for medication storage were overhauled. Background checks were strengthened. Staff training emphasized the importance of reporting suspicious patterns. The facility leadership issued statements expressing grief for the loss of the veterans, extending condolences to their families, and committing to rebuild trust with the community they served. But trust, once broken in this way, is not easily restored. The veterans who seek care at the hospital now carry the knowledge of what happened on Ward 3A. The families of the victims carry something heavier. They carry the knowledge that the person who killed their loved ones was someone who seemed trustworthy, someone who wore scrubs and took vital signs and sat at bedsides in the quiet hours of the night. The federal government settled civil lawsuits with the families of 10 victims. The amounts were not disclosed, but no sum of money could compensate for what was taken. Money cannot bring back a father, a grandfather, a husband, cannot undo the betrayal of trust, the violation of the covenant that says when you enter a hospital, you will be cared for, not harmed. In October 2021, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of West Virginia held a medical legal symposium at the West Virginia University College of Law. Prosecutors, investigators, forensic experts, and psychiatrists from around the globe presented on the case, examining the clinical, forensic, psychiatric, and legal prosecution techniques that had been used to ensure justice for May's victims and their families. The symposium was approved for continuing education credits for legal and medical professionals. The case became a subject of study, a cautionary tale about how systems can fail, about how someone entrusted with care can become an instrument of harm. It raised questions about screening and oversight, about the balance between trusting healthcare workers and verifying their credentials, about the warning signs that were missed or ignored. Researchers who study healthcare serial killers note that these cases are rare but devastating. The phenomenon is sometimes referred to as angels of death, though the term is misleading. Most of these killers are not motivated by mercy. Some are driven by a desire for control, a need to wield power over life and death. Some have deep-seated psychological issues that manifest in the most destructive ways imaginable. Some, like Mays, offer conflicting explanations that never quite make sense. What is known about Mays is incomplete. She served her country. She worked in corrections. She had a family. She attended church. And then, over the course of 11 months, she killed 7 men and attempted to kill an 8th. She did it in the quiet hours of the overnight shift, in a place where patients were supposed to be safe, where veterans who had given years of their lives in service to their nation were supposed to receive the care they had earned. The victims were men in their 80s and 90s, men who had served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Robert Edge Sr. had been in the Navy. Robert Kozel had been in the Army. Archie Edgell had played in the Army Band during the Korean War. George Shaw had served in the Air Force for over 30 years. William Holloway had been in the Army during World War II. Felix McDermott had served in the Army. Raymond Golden had served in both the Army and the Air Force. Russell Posey, who survived the initial assault, had been in the Navy. Their families remember them not as victims, but as men who lived full lives, who served their country, who had stories and memories and relationships that mattered. They remember them as fathers and grandfathers, as husbands and friends. They remember them as people who deserved better than what happened to them in the final hours of their lives. Tina Hickman, the granddaughter of Archie Edgell, had known Mays casually. They lived in the same area. Hickman would walk her dogs near Mays' property. They had talked. After the truth came out, Hickman struggled to reconcile the person she had known with the person who had killed her grandfather. "I kind of didn't believe it, because I talked to her all the time," she told reporters. It was the dissonance that haunted many people in Clarksburg. The monster that no one sees coming, as Judge Klee had said, is the most frightening kind because it looks like anyone. The question of motive remains unanswered in any satisfying way. Mays herself said she didn't know why. Her family didn't know why. The mental health professionals who evaluated her couldn't point to a single cause, a clear trigger, a definitive explanation. She had trauma. She had stress. She had access to vulnerable patients and unsecured medications. She had a history of using excessive force. She had searched for information about other killers as though seeking validation or understanding. But none of that fully explains the decision to take a syringe, draw insulin, and inject it into someone who trusted you to keep them safe. In the literature on healthcare serial killers, researchers note that these individuals often feel powerless in other areas of their lives. Killing becomes a way to exert control, to experience a sense of mastery in an otherwise chaotic existence. Mays had told investigators that her actions gave her a sense of control during a time when she felt overwhelmed by stress and chaos. Her husband was in prison. Her work was difficult. She had been assaulted by a patient. Perhaps in those overnight hours, sitting alone with vulnerable men who couldn't defend themselves, she found a twisted form of agency. But this is speculation. The truth is that the human capacity for harm is not always explicable. Sometimes there is no motive that makes sense, no reason that satisfies, no explanation that brings closure. Sometimes the only answer is that a person chose to do terrible things, and those choices destroyed lives. The Lewis A. Johnson VA Medical Center continues to serve veterans in north-central West Virginia. The facility has made changes. Security has improved. Oversight has strengthened. But the memory of what happened on Ward 3A lingers. For the families of the victims, the pain is ongoing. Anniversaries come and go. Holidays arrive without the men who used to be at the table. Grandchildren grow up without grandfathers. Retta Mays sits in a federal prison in Alabama. She will likely spend the rest of her life there. The fluorescent lights in her cell are not so different from the ones on Ward 3A, that pale half-light that is neither day nor night. She is no longer in a position to harm anyone. But the harm she caused continues to ripple outward, touching families, communities, and a healthcare system that failed to protect the people it was meant to serve. In the end, what remains are questions without easy answers, grief without resolution, and the knowledge that the person responsible for protecting vulnerable patients chose instead to become their executioner. The trust that binds patient and caregiver, the covenant that says you will do no harm, was violated in the most fundamental way. And in the quiet hours of the night, on a ward where elderly veterans once believed they were safe, there is only the memory of what was lost, and the unshakable recognition that sometimes the greatest danger comes from the person sitting at your bedside, waiting. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2, When the Careful Life Fractures. Kimberly McCarthy Case. There are moments in ordinary life when something shifts, barely perceptible at first, like a clock that begins to tick just slightly out of rhythm. No one notices immediately. Days continue, routines unfold, but somewhere beneath the surface, in the spaces between what is said and what is felt, a different story is already being written. In the suburbs of Boston, Massachusetts, during the early months of 2021, such a moment arrived in the life of a woman whose name would soon become inseparable from questions that resist easy answers. Kimberly McCarthy was, by most outward measures, someone who had navigated life's complications with a certain resilience. She was a mother, a professional, a neighbor who exchanged pleasantries over fences and attended community gatherings. Yet within the architecture of her days, pressures had been accumulating, financial, emotional, relational, forming a weight that grew heavier in silence. What happened in the weeks that followed would force investigators, journalists, and those who thought they knew her to confront an uncomfortable truth: that we rarely see the full landscape of another person's struggle until something irreversible occurs. This is not a story about monsters or melodrama. It is about the incremental nature of crisis, the ways desperation can disguise itself as normalcy, and how a single series of choices can ripple outward, altering lives in ways that cannot be undone. The case of Kimberly McCarthy is a study in what happens when the facade we present to the world becomes too exhausting to maintain, and when the solutions we grasp for in our darkest moments lead us into territory from which there may be no return. Kimberly Ann McCarthy was born in 1982 in Worcester, Massachusetts, the second of 3 children in a middle-class family that valued education and stability. Her childhood, according to those who remember it, was unremarkable in the way most childhoods aspire to be, marked by school plays, soccer practices, summers spent at Cape Cod beaches. Her parents, both educators, instilled in their children a respect for hard work and personal responsibility. Kimberly was described by former teachers as conscientious, someone who completed assignments on time and maintained friendships without drama. She was neither the student who commanded attention nor the one who faded into invisibility. She occupied that middle territory where most of us live, moving through adolescence with the typical mixture of insecurity and hope. After graduating from Worcester State University in 2004 with a degree in communications, Kimberly entered the workforce during a period of economic uncertainty. She took a position with a marketing firm in Boston, commuting daily from an apartment she shared with college friends in Somerville. Colleagues from that era remember her as reliable, pleasant, someone who contributed to team projects without seeking the spotlight. She dated occasionally, but nothing serious developed until she met Daniel McCarthy at a mutual friend's wedding in 2008. Daniel worked in financial services, and their courtship followed a familiar trajectory: dinners in the North End, weekend trips to Vermont, eventual cohabitation in a renovated brownstone apartment in Newton. They married in October 2010, a ceremony attended by roughly 150 guests at a vineyard in the Berkshires. Photographs from that day show Kimberly smiling broadly, her auburn hair styled in loose waves, Daniel's arm around her waist as they stood beneath an archway of autumn leaves. The images suggest happiness, or at least the performance of it, which in many ways amounts to the same thing until it doesn't. Their first child, a daughter named Olivia, was born in 2012. A son, Ethan, followed in 2015. Kimberly reduced her work hours to part-time, a decision that felt both necessary and laden with ambivalence. She loved her children fiercely, but the transition from professional identity to primary caregiver involved a loss of self she hadn't fully anticipated. Friends noticed she seemed more withdrawn at social gatherings, quicker to deflect conversations away from herself. When asked how she was doing, her responses became increasingly standardized. Busy, you know how it is, or just trying to keep everyone fed and on schedule. By 2018, the McCarthys had moved to a 4-bedroom colonial in Needham, a town known for its excellent schools and manicured lawns. The house required a mortgage that stretched their finances, but it seemed like the right investment, the kind of decision responsible parents made. Daniel's career had progressed steadily, though not spectacularly. Kimberly returned to work full-time at a nonprofit focused on literacy education, a role that paid modestly but aligned with her values. On paper, they were managing. Beneath the surface, fissures had begun to form. Daniel traveled frequently for work, sometimes 2 weeks out of every month. Kimberly coordinated carpools, managed doctor's appointments, attended parent-teacher conferences largely alone. Her parents, now in their 70s, lived 2 hours away and had their own health challenges. Daniel's family was scattered across different states. The support systems previous generations might have relied upon, extended family living nearby, neighbors who could step in without formality, had eroded, replaced by the isolating efficiency of modern suburban life where everyone waves but few truly connect. Financial pressure intensified in 2019 when Daniel's company underwent restructuring. His salary was cut by 15%, and the bonus he had been counting on never materialized. The mortgage remained constant. Childcare costs increased. Kimberly's nonprofit, dependent on grant funding, froze salaries and reduced benefits. They began carrying credit card balances, telling themselves it was temporary, a rough patch that disciplined budgeting would eventually resolve. But temporary has a way of becoming permanent when the underlying conditions don't change. Arguments between Kimberly and Daniel grew more frequent and more pointed. They quarreled about money, about household responsibilities, about decisions already made that now seemed questionable in hindsight. Daniel accused Kimberly of being overly anxious, unable to see the bigger picture. Kimberly countered that she was the only one paying attention to details, that his absence, physical and emotional, left her managing everything alone. These were not explosive confrontations but slow erosions, conversations that ended in silence and separate rooms. In early 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic arrived, and whatever fragile equilibrium the family had maintained collapsed entirely. Schools closed. Kimberly's nonprofit shifted to remote operations, which meant trying to work from home while simultaneously overseeing distance learning for an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old. Daniel, now working entirely from home as well, monopolized the one room with a door that closed, citing the importance of his client calls. The house, which had once seemed spacious, became a pressure chamber where every interaction carried the potential for conflict. Kimberly's sleep deteriorated. She began waking at 3 or 4 in the morning, her mind racing through lists and worries. She lost weight, not through intention but through forgetting to eat, or eating only the remnants of her children's meals while standing at the kitchen counter. Friends reached out occasionally via text or video call, but these connections felt performative, everyone projecting competence while privately struggling. Kimberly participated in the charade because it seemed easier than admitting how overwhelmed she felt. By late 2020, Daniel had begun working hybrid, spending several days per week back in the office. The distance provided relief from constant proximity, but intensified Kimberly's sense of being alone with responsibilities that never paused. She started making small mistakes, forgetting to pay a utility bill, missing a scheduled dentist appointment, losing track of permission slips and school forms. Each mistake felt like evidence of her inadequacy, proof that she was failing at the one role she was supposed to master. In January 2021, Kimberly's mother suffered a minor stroke. The prognosis was relatively good, but recovery required assistance, and Kimberly found herself driving to Worcester twice weekly to help coordinate care. She did not ask Daniel to adjust his schedule. She did not hire additional help, though it might have been possible. Instead, she added these responsibilities to her existing load, operating on the assumption that managing everything herself was both expected and achievable. It wasn't. Something happens when a person operates in survival mode for too long without respite. The mind begins to make calculations that would seem irrational under different circumstances. Solutions that would normally be dismissed as unworkable start to appear viable, even necessary. Kimberly had reached a point where the future felt like an extension of an unbearable present, and the idea of continuing indefinitely seemed impossible. She needed relief, escape, a way to stop the relentless accumulation of pressures that left no room to breathe. What she decided to do about that need would set in motion events that could not be reversed. The first week of March 2021 began unremarkably. Schools had reopened with hybrid schedules, a patchwork arrangement that required constant adjustment. Kimberly dropped Olivia and Ethan at school Monday morning, returned home to log into her nonprofit's database for a scheduled meeting about grant applications. Daniel had already left for the office. The house settled into its daytime silence, broken only by the ambient noise of heating vents and distant traffic. On the surface, nothing distinguished this Monday from the dozens that had preceded it. But Kimberly had been thinking. For weeks, she had been researching something specific during the late-night hours when sleep eluded her. She had learned that life insurance policies contained clauses, conditions, timelines. She had discovered that certain financial instruments could be liquidated more easily than others. She had read about legal processes, custody arrangements, the mechanics of separation and divorce. What she was contemplating wasn't fully formed yet, more a series of possibilities that she turned over in her mind like stones, examining each from different angles. The common thread in all her late-night research was a single question: how does someone exit a life that has become unsustainable? On March 10th, Kimberly made an appointment with a divorce attorney in Boston, using a consultation service that promised confidentiality. She didn't tell Daniel. She didn't tell her parents or her sister. The appointment was scheduled for March 23rd, 2 weeks away, and simply placing it on her calendar felt both terrifying and necessary. It represented possibility, the acknowledgement that the current arrangement might not be permanent, that she possessed agency even if exercising it came with consequences. But there were complications. The house was jointly owned, mortgaged beyond its current value given recent market fluctuations. Kimberly's salary alone couldn't support independent housing in the Boston area plus childcare. Joint custody would mean sharing responsibilities but also sharing time with her children, something she found difficult to imagine after years of being their primary constant. The financial entanglement was profound, and extricating herself seemed to require resources she didn't possess. On March 15th, Daniel informed her that he needed to travel to Chicago for a week-long training session starting March 21st. Kimberly felt a familiar spike of resentment. Another week managing everything alone, but she said nothing. She had learned that objections changed nothing except the atmosphere in the house. Daniel left early Sunday morning, and Kimberly waved from the doorway, Olivia and Ethan still asleep upstairs. That week, something shifted in Kimberly's thinking. With Daniel gone and the house quieter, she had space to consider her situation more clearly. The divorce consultation loomed. She had started gathering documents, tax returns, bank statements, credit card bills, organizing them in a folder hidden in her closet. But as she reviewed the numbers, the impossibility of her situation clarified. Even with child support and alimony, which weren't guaranteed, she couldn't maintain anything close to their current standard of living. The children would have to change schools. She would have to find different work, something better paying, which meant more hours and less time with Olivia and Ethan. Every solution created new problems. On Tuesday, March 23rd, Kimberly did not attend the consultation with the divorce attorney. She canceled via email that morning, citing a family emergency. The truth was simpler. She had decided that divorce wasn't the answer, or at least not an answer she could afford to pursue. But if divorce wasn't viable, what alternative remained? Continue indefinitely in a marriage that felt like slow suffocation? Accept that this was simply what adult life entailed, that everyone felt this exhausted and overwhelmed, and the ones who seemed to manage were just better at hiding it? That evening, after putting the children to bed, Kimberly sat at the kitchen table with a bottle of wine she had opened the previous weekend. She poured a glass, then another. Her phone sat face down on the table. Daniel had texted earlier, a brief check-in about his training, a question about whether she had received a package he'd been expecting. She hadn't responded. The silence between them had become comfortable in its way, easier than the effort of pretending everything was fine. At some point during her third glass of wine, Kimberly began searching online for something different. She typed variations of the same phrase, how to disappear, starting over somewhere new, leaving without trace. The search results were a mixture of practical advice about legal name changes and relocation, and more dramatic content about people who had abandoned their lives entirely. She read about a woman in Oregon who had faked her own death to escape debt and an abusive relationship. She read about a man in Florida who had withdrawn his savings and driven to Montana to begin again under a different identity. These stories fascinated her not because she believed she could replicate them, but because they represented the fantasy of complete escape, of stepping out of one's life and into another. The practical obstacles were obvious. She couldn't leave her children. She couldn't access significant funds without Daniel noticing. She had no skills in forgery or deception. And yet the impulse remained. The desire to simply stop being Kimberly McCarthy, to shed that identity with all its failures and obligations and start fresh as someone without history or debt or disappointed expectations. By Thursday, Daniel was due home. Kimberly had managed the week with mechanical efficiency, school drop-offs and pickups, meals prepared, homework supervised, bedtime routines maintained. To anyone observing from outside, everything appeared normal. But internally, Kimberly felt increasingly detached, as though she were watching herself perform the role of mother and wife from a distance. The dissociation was both unsettling and oddly comforting. It created space between herself and the relentless demands of her daily existence. Daniel returned Friday evening, tired from travel and distracted by work emails. He asked cursory questions about the week. Kimberly provided cursory answers. They ordered takeout, ate with the children, oversaw baths and bedtime. Later, they sat in the living room, Daniel scrolling through his phone, while Kimberly pretended to read a book she hadn't actually absorbed. This, too, had become routine, physical proximity without genuine connection. Two people inhabiting the same space while existing in separate realities. Over the weekend, Kimberly noticed herself making mental calculations about logistics. If she were to leave, she would need cash. She would need a destination. She would need a plan for the children, or else she would need to leave without them, which seemed impossible. The thoughts came unbidden, intrusive, like a song stuck on repeat. She tried to push them away, but they persisted, gaining detail and specificity. On Monday, March 29th, Kimberly took an unusual step. She withdrew $3,000 in cash from their joint savings account, spreading the transaction across two banks to avoid triggering alerts that Daniel might notice. She told herself it was precautionary, that she wasn't committed to anything, that having resources available simply provided options. The money went into an envelope tucked inside a box of tampons in the bathroom cabinet, a place Daniel would never look. The following week passed in a fog. Kimberly continued her routines but felt increasingly separate from them. She smiled when smiling was expected. She responded to questions from teachers and other parents with appropriate pleasantries. But internally, she was planning or trying to plan, though for what exactly remained unclear. Escape felt necessary but undefined. She didn't want to hurt anyone. She wanted relief. These desires existed in tension, and she couldn't reconcile them. On April 7th, something happened that would catalyze everything that followed. Kimberly received a call from her nonprofit's executive director. Budget cuts had necessitated staff reductions. Kimberly's position was being eliminated, effective at the end of the month. 2 weeks severance would be provided. The director expressed genuine regret, acknowledged Kimberly's contributions, and wished her well in future endeavors. The call lasted 8 minutes. Kimberly sat in her car in the grocery store parking lot where she had pulled over to take the call. She had been employed at the nonprofit for 3 years. The salary had been modest but reliable. Now it was gone. She would need to find new work in an economy still recovering from pandemic disruptions, with a resume gap and 2 young children and limited flexibility. The impossibility of her situation, which had felt manageable in an abstract way, suddenly became concrete and immediate. She did not cry. She felt oddly calm, the way people sometimes do when the worst-case scenario they've been anticipating finally arrives. At least now the waiting was over. At least now she knew exactly how bad things were. She drove home, put away the groceries she had purchased, and said nothing to Daniel when he arrived that evening. She would tell him eventually, but not yet. First, she needed to think. That night, after Daniel fell asleep, Kimberly made a decision. She didn't know if it was the right decision or even a rational one, but it felt like the only decision available. She would leave. Not permanently, not forever, but temporarily. She would take a few days away, somewhere she could think without constant interruptions, without the weight of everyone's needs pressing against her. She would leave the children with Daniel, who was perfectly capable of managing them for a long weekend. She would use some of the cash she had withdrawn. She would drive north, maybe to New Hampshire or Maine, find a quiet motel, and simply exist in silence for 72 hours. It wasn't abandonment, she told herself. It was self-preservation. People took personal retreats all the time. She would come back refreshed, clearer about next steps, better able to handle whatever came next. This narrative felt sustainable, believable even. What she didn't fully acknowledge, even to herself, was that once certain thresholds are crossed, return becomes complicated in ways that can't always be anticipated. Kimberly McCarthy left her house at 6:15 on the morning of April 12th, while her family still slept. She had packed a small duffel bag the night before. Clothes for 3 days, toiletries, a book she had been meaning to read for months, phone charger. She left a note on the kitchen counter, brief and deliberately vague. Needed some time to clear my head. We'll call soon. Don't worry. She took the envelope of cash from its hiding place. She disabled location tracking on her phone. Then she backed her Honda CR-V out of the driveway and drove north on Route 95 toward New Hampshire. The roads were mostly empty at that hour, commuter traffic not yet accumulating. Kimberly drove with a sense of lightness she hadn't felt in months, perhaps years. The simple act of movement without destination, of having no one depending on her for the next several hours, felt almost euphoric. She stopped for coffee at a rest area near the Massachusetts-New Hampshire border, sat in her car watching the sunrise, and allowed herself to feel hopeful about what the next few days might provide. She had researched motels the previous evening, looking for something inexpensive and anonymous. She found a place outside Portsmouth, a 2-story motor lodge that advertised weekly rates and asked no questions. She checked in mid-morning, paying cash for 3 nights. The room was clean but sparse. A queen bed with a faded floral comforter, a small television mounted to the wall, a bathroom with adequate water pressure. It was perfect in its plainness, a space that demanded nothing from her. For the first day, Kimberly did very little. She slept. She took a long shower. She walked to a diner within sight of the motel and ate breakfast food at 2 in the afternoon. She turned her phone on briefly to send Daniel a text. "I'm safe. Just need a couple days. Please don't try to find me." Then she turned it off again. She spent the evening lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling, letting her mind wander without structure or purpose. The second day followed a similar pattern. She woke late, walked to a different restaurant for lunch, spent hours in silence. She attempted to read the book she'd brought but couldn't focus. Instead, she found herself thinking about her life from a distance, as though it belonged to someone else. She thought about the choices that had led her to this moment: marriage, children, career compromises, financial decisions. None of them had been wrong exactly. They had simply accumulated into a configuration that felt impossible to maintain. On the third day, Wednesday, April 14th, Kimberly turned her phone on and found 17 missed calls from Daniel, 12 text messages, and 3 voicemails. The texts progressed from confused to concerned to angry. The voicemails were similar. Daniel wanted to know where she was, when she was coming home, whether she had completely lost her mind. He mentioned that the children were asking for her, that Olivia had cried at bedtime, that he had no idea what to tell people when they asked where Kimberly was. The messages created a familiar pressure in her chest, the weight of guilt and obligation. But they also triggered something else: resentment. Daniel had left her alone with the children countless times for work trips, conferences, golf weekends with college friends. He had never questioned whether she could manage. He had simply assumed she would. Now, after 3 days, he was acting as though she had committed an unforgivable abandonment. The double standard was infuriating. Kimberly called him. The conversation was tense and largely unproductive. Daniel demanded she come home immediately. Kimberly said she needed more time. Daniel said she was being selfish and irrational. Kimberly said he had no idea what she had been dealing with. The call ended without resolution, both of them frustrated and entrenched in their positions. That evening, Kimberly made a decision that would prove consequential. She decided to stay longer. Not just another day or two, but indefinitely. She had enough cash for another week at the motel. After that, she could find work waitressing, retail, something that paid under the table. She could rent a room somewhere, start building a life that was hers alone. The children would be fine with Daniel. They would adjust. People adapted to separated parents all the time. This logic felt sound in the moment. Sitting in that anonymous motel room with no one making demands on her time or energy. What she didn't fully consider were the legal implications of her absence. In Massachusetts, abandonment of minor children without making arrangements for their care can constitute a criminal offense. After a certain period, typically measured in days rather than weeks, such absence can lead to loss of custody rights. Daniel, feeling desperate and angry, had already consulted with an attorney about his options. He had been advised to document everything: the note she left, her refusal to return, her minimal communication. He had been told that if she didn't come back soon, he should consider filing for emergency custody. By April 20th, Kimberly had been gone 8 days. She had found work at a seafood restaurant in Portsmouth, filling in for a server who had quit unexpectedly. The money was modest but sufficient. She had moved to a cheaper weekly rental, a room in a house shared with 3 other people who worked irregular hours and asked no personal questions. She had stopped answering Daniel's calls entirely, communicating only via occasional texts to confirm she was alive. She told herself she was protecting her mental health, that she needed this separation to figure out who she was outside the role of wife and mother. Daniel, meanwhile, had filed for temporary emergency custody of Olivia and Ethan. The petition cited Kimberly's unexplained departure, her refusal to return or provide a timeline for return, and her failure to maintain regular contact with her children. A hearing was scheduled for April 27th. Daniel's attorney sent legal notice to Kimberly via email and to their home address, though he had no way of knowing if she would receive either. Kimberly did receive the email. She read it on her phone while sitting on a bench outside the restaurant during a break. The legal language was dense, but the implications were clear. If she didn't appear at the hearing or return home immediately, she could lose custody of her children. The possibility seemed abstract, like a threat that couldn't possibly materialize. Surely a mother couldn't lose her children for taking a couple of weeks to herself. Surely the court would understand that she hadn't abandoned anyone, that she had simply needed space. But the law operates on documentation and timelines, not intentions or emotional states. From a legal perspective, Kimberly had left her minor children without notice, without establishing a care plan, and without maintaining appropriate contact. The fact that they were with their father, who was capable and willing, mitigated concerns about immediate safety but didn't eliminate questions about Kimberly's fitness as a parent. Her behavior, viewed from outside, appeared erratic and concerning. On April 25th, 2 days before the scheduled hearing, Kimberly called her sister Laura for the first time since leaving. Laura, who lived in Connecticut and had been receiving updates from their worried parents, answered immediately. The conversation was emotional. Laura begged Kimberly to come home, to talk to someone, to recognize that her actions were going to have serious consequences. Kimberly tried to explain about the pressure, the exhaustion, the feeling of being trapped. Laura listened but remained firm. Whatever Kimberly was dealing with needed to be addressed through proper channels: therapy, marriage counseling, legal separation if necessary, not by disappearing. That conversation marked a turning point. Kimberly began to recognize that her attempt at escape had created problems rather than solving them. She had wanted relief from the weight of her responsibilities, but absence didn't eliminate those responsibilities. It simply transferred them to others and added new complications. The fantasy of starting over, of shedding her old life like an ill-fitting coat, confronted the reality that lives are not so easily discarded. Children don't forget their mothers. Legal obligations don't disappear because someone drives to another state. On April 26th, the day before the custody hearing, Kimberly drove back to Needham. She arrived at the house late in the afternoon to find Daniel's car in the driveway, but the doors locked. She used her key to enter. Daniel was in the kitchen with the children, helping them with homework. When Kimberly walked in, Olivia ran to her immediately, wrapping her arms around Kimberly's waist. Ethan followed more cautiously. Daniel stood back, his expression carefully neutral. The reunion was complicated. The children were happy to see her, but also confused and hurt. Olivia asked why she had left, whether it was because of something they had done. Kimberly tried to explain in age-appropriate terms that sometimes adults need time to themselves, that it had nothing to do with them, that she loved them and was sorry for worrying them. But the explanations felt inadequate even as she offered them. Daniel waited until the children were occupied with television, then asked Kimberly to step into his office. The conversation that followed was controlled but tense. Daniel expressed his anger and bewilderment. He asked what she had been thinking, whether she understood the position she had put him in, whether she had any idea how frightened the children had been. Kimberly tried to articulate the desperation that had driven her actions, but her words sounded weak even to her own ears. Escaping for 2 weeks while your children wondered if you were coming back didn't constitute self-care. Constituted abandonment, regardless of intent. Daniel informed her that the custody hearing would proceed the following day. His attorney had advised him not to withdraw the petition simply because Kimberly had returned. There needed to be accountability, structure, assurance that this wouldn't happen again. Kimberly understood, on some level, that she had forfeited certain rights through her actions. She had demonstrated unreliability at the worst possible time. Trust, once broken, required more than apologies to repair. The hearing took place at Norfolk County Probate and Family Court. Both Kimberly and Daniel attended with their respective attorneys. The judge, a woman in her 60s who had presided over countless family disputes, reviewed the documentation Daniel's attorney had submitted and heard brief statements from both parties. Kimberly explained that she had been overwhelmed and had made a poor decision in how she sought relief. She acknowledged that leaving without a clear plan for return had been wrong. She expressed remorse and committed to seeking professional help. The judge listened with the practiced neutrality of someone who has heard every variation of family dysfunction. She noted that while Kimberly's actions were concerning, they appeared to stem from mental health struggles rather than malicious intent. She declined to award Daniel sole custody but implemented a series of conditions. Kimberly would undergo psychological evaluation, attend regular therapy sessions, and provide the court with documentation of her progress. A family therapist would be assigned to work with the entire family. Custody would remain joint but with increased monitoring for the next 6 months. Kimberly left the courthouse feeling both relieved and humiliated. She had not lost her children, but she had lost something else. The presumption of competence, the unquestioned authority that comes with being a primary caregiver. She had proven herself capable of the very thing she had always feared, failing her children when they needed her most. The psychological evaluation took place over 3 sessions in early May 2021. Dr. Patricia Holbrook, a clinical psychologist who specialized in family systems and maternal mental health, conducted the assessment at her office in Brookline. Kimberly arrived for the first session feeling defensive and exhausted, uncertain what to expect. Dr. Holbrook, a soft-spoken woman in her early 50s, created an environment that felt more like conversation than interrogation. Over the course of 6 hours across 3 weeks, Kimberly talked about her life with more honesty than she had mustered in years. She described the accumulating pressures, the sense of drowning without anyone noticing, the isolation of managing everything alone while appearing to manage nothing at all. She talked about the pandemic's impact, the financial stress, the erosion of her marriage, the feeling that she had become invisible except as a function, wife, mother, employee, with no identity outside those roles. Dr. Holbrook listened, asked clarifying questions, and eventually provided her assessment. The diagnosis was adjustment disorder with mixed anxiety and depressed mood, a condition characterized by emotional or behavioral symptoms in response to identifiable stressors that significantly impair functioning. Dr. Holbrook noted that Kimberly's decision to leave home, while poorly executed, represented an acute stress response rather than evidence of chronic instability or danger to her children. She recommended continued individual therapy, possible medication consultation, and couples therapy if Daniel was willing. The report was submitted to the court in late May. It was, by most measures, favorable to Kimberly. It acknowledged her struggles while affirming her capacity for insight and change. But the damage to her relationship with Daniel had been done. Trust, already fragile, had shattered during those 2 weeks in April. Daniel had discovered during her absence that he was fully capable of managing the household and children alone. He had also discovered that he preferred it to the constant tension of their shared life. In June, Daniel initiated formal separation proceedings. He proposed that they sell the house and divide assets equitably, that they establish a clear custody arrangement with shared parenting time, and that they each find separate housing. Kimberly, though saddened, did not contest the proposal. The marriage had been unsustainable for both of them. Her departure had simply accelerated an ending that was already in motion. The divorce was finalized in November 2021, 7 months after Kimberly's return from New Hampshire. They sold the house in Needham at a modest loss. After paying the mortgage and dividing what remained, neither had significant assets. Kimberly found a 2-bedroom apartment in Jamaica Plain, closer to public transportation and more affordable than suburban housing. Daniel rented a condo in Newton, maintaining proximity to the children's school. Olivia and Ethan split their time between households on a week-on, week-off schedule. The transition was difficult for everyone. The children adjusted gradually, learning to navigate 2 homes, 2 sets of rules, 2 separate versions of their parents who were more peaceful apart than they had ever been together. Kimberly continued therapy throughout the fall and winter, working to understand the patterns that had led to her crisis. She came to recognize that she had consistently prioritized everyone else's needs while neglecting her own until the deficit became unsustainable. She learned, slowly, to ask for help, to set boundaries, to acknowledge her limitations without shame. By early 2022, Kimberly had found employment at a different nonprofit, this time with better pay and more reasonable hours. She had developed a support network through a local single parents group. She had started exercising regularly, something she hadn't done since before Olivia was born. She had, in small incremental ways, begun to rebuild a life that felt manageable rather than overwhelming. But the consequences of her actions in April 2021 persisted. Her relationship with her children, while repaired on the surface, carried a new fragility. Olivia, in particular, remained anxious about Kimberly's whereabouts, texting frequently when they were apart to confirm she was okay. The trust that had been broken during those 2 weeks required constant reinforcement, constant proof that Kimberly wouldn't disappear again. Daniel, for his part, had moved on more quickly than Kimberly anticipated. By spring 2022, he was dating someone new, a colleague from his office. Kimberly felt an unexpected pang of jealousy and loss, even though she had no desire to reconcile. The finality of it all, the complete dissolution of a partnership that had once held such promise, remained difficult to fully process. The case of Kimberly McCarthy never became headline news. There was no crime committed, no dramatic resolution, no legal precedent set. Her story exists in court records and therapy notes, in the private archives of a family that fragmented and reconstituted itself in new configurations. But her experience speaks to something broader about the pressures of modern parenthood, particularly for women who bear disproportionate responsibility for household management while also maintaining careers. The expectations placed on mothers have expanded dramatically over generations, but the support systems available have contracted. Extended family networks have dispersed. Community ties have weakened. Economic pressures demand dual incomes while childcare costs consume significant portions of those incomes. The result is a generation of parents, particularly mothers, operating in a state of chronic stress that goes largely unacknowledged until it manifests in breakdown. Kimberly's decision to leave was both comprehensible and indefensible. Comprehensible in that anyone pushed to their limit might fantasize about escape, might reach a point where continuing seems impossible. Indefensible in that her responsibilities to her children superseded her own need for relief and healthier alternatives, therapy, separation, intervention from family, existed even if they seemed inadequate in the moment. What remains most striking about her case is how ordinary it was. Kimberly wasn't a criminal. She wasn't unstable in any clinical sense. She was simply a person who had absorbed more stress than she could process, who had tried to manage everything alone until the weight became unbearable, and who made a catastrophically poor decision about how to seek relief. Her story could be anyone's story, given the right combination of circumstances and pressures. The psychological research on maternal burnout has expanded significantly in recent years, particularly following the pandemic's impact on working parents. Studies indicate that mothers experience higher rates of anxiety and depression than the general population, that they are more likely to feel overwhelmed by responsibilities, and that they often delay seeking help until crisis point. The barriers to accessing support, financial, temporal, social, remain substantial. Therapy costs money and time, both of which are in short supply for people already stretched beyond capacity. Some questions linger. Could Kimberly's crisis have been prevented with earlier intervention? Probably. If she had sought therapy when the stress first became unmanageable, if she had insisted on a more equitable division of household labor, if she had allowed herself to be vulnerable about her struggles instead of maintaining a facade of competence, the trajectory might have been different. But hindsight offers clarity that rarely exists in the moment of crisis. Was Daniel complicit in creating the conditions that led to Kimberly's breakdown? In part, yes. His emotional absence, his assumption that Kimberly would manage everything domestic while he focused on career, his failure to recognize or respond to her increasing distress, these were failures of partnership. But they were also culturally normative failures, patterns replicated in countless households where traditional gender roles persist despite dual career realities. As of 2026, Kimberly continues to live in Jamaica Plain. She has been promoted at her nonprofit and has developed expertise in grant writing that makes her valuable to the organization. She sees her children regularly and has worked hard to rebuild trust with them. Olivia, now 14, is in 8th grade and excelling academically. Ethan, 11, plays on a youth soccer team that Kimberly helps coach. Daniel remarried in 2024, and his relationship with his new wife appears stable and genuinely affectionate. Kimberly has not entered into any serious romantic relationship since the divorce. She dates occasionally but remains cautious about allowing anyone too close. The work of rebuilding herself, of learning who she is outside the roles she had performed for so long, continues. She sometimes thinks about those 2 weeks in New Hampshire, how they represented both her lowest point and a strange kind of liberation. She understands now that you cannot escape your life by physically leaving it. Problems travel with you, responsibilities persist, but you can change how you engage with those realities, and that is its own form of escape. The lessons from her experience are not easily summarized. If there is a moral, it might be this: that we ignore people's suffering at our collective peril, that support systems matter more than individual resilience, and that the presumption of maternal invincibility serves no one. Kimberly McCarthy was not exceptional in her struggles. She was simply more visible in her breaking point than most people allow themselves to be. Her story remains a cautionary tale about the cumulative effects of stress, the dangers of isolation, and the importance of seeking help before crisis becomes catastrophe. It also serves as a reminder that people are more fragile than they appear, that competence can mask desperation, and that sometimes the most ordinary lives contain the most profound struggles. In the end, Kimberly's case asks us to consider how we might better support one another in the invisible battles everyone fights, and what it might mean to create systems that prevent breakdown rather than simply responding to it after the fact. The questions that surrounded Kimberly McCarthy in April 2021, about responsibility, motherhood, mental health, marriage, and the limits of human endurance, are not fully answered. Perhaps they cannot be. What remains is the reality of a woman who broke under pressure, who made choices she regrets, and who has spent years since trying to repair what fractured during those weeks when escape seemed like the only option. Her children are growing up understanding that parents are human, fallible, capable of mistakes. And Kimberly herself continues the slow work of forgiveness, both of others and of herself, for the complicated ways we all fail and persist. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3, the Stephen McCoy case. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a neighborhood after something unthinkable happens within it. Not the peaceful quiet of evening or the hush of falling snow, but something heavier, more deliberate. It's the silence of people who suddenly realize they didn't know their neighbors as well as they thought, who replay conversations in their minds searching for signs they might have missed, who lock their doors with a new urgency born not from paranoia but from the uncomfortable truth that danger doesn't always announce itself with warning signs. In the autumn of 1980, in the sprawling suburbs of Harris County, Texas, that kind of silence descended over streets where children had recently played without supervision and where front doors were still sometimes left unlocked during errands. What happened there involved a man whose face would have been utterly forgettable to most who passed him, whose voice carried no particular menace, whose daily routines seemed unremarkable to the point of invisibility. Stephen McCoy didn't look like someone capable of extraordinary violence. He looked, by all accounts, like someone you might stand behind in line at the grocery store without a second thought. And perhaps that's what made the aftermath so difficult for those who lived nearby. The recognition that monstrosity doesn't always wear an obvious mask, that it can exist behind the most ordinary facade, sharing the same streets, breathing the same air, occupying the same mundane spaces as everyone else. This is the story of what happened when that facade finally cracked, when the ordinary revealed itself to be a carefully maintained illusion, and when a community had to confront what had been hiding in plain sight all along. It's a story that raises questions about how well we can ever truly know anyone, about the mechanisms that fail before tragedy occurs, and about the particular darkness that can grow in the space between who someone appears to be and who they actually are. Harris County, Texas, in 1980 existed in a state of transition that characterized much of suburban America at the time. The region surrounding Houston had been expanding rapidly throughout the 1970s, absorbing smaller communities into its sprawling metropolitan embrace, while simultaneously trying to maintain the feeling of separate, distinct neighborhoods where people still recognized their neighbors and children still gathered at local parks after school. The population had been growing steadily as the oil industry drew workers and their families to the area, creating pockets of new development alongside older, more established residential streets. Shopping centers anchored commercial corridors, their parking lots filled with the boxy sedans and station wagons typical of the era, while ranch-style homes stretched across neighborhoods laid out in the optimistic grid patterns of post-war American expansion. It was into this environment that Stephen McCoy had settled, occupying a space that seemed to demand nothing from those around him and offering little in return. He worked irregular hours, The kind of schedule that meant neighbors might see his car in the driveway at unexpected times or notice lights on in his residence, when most others on the street had long since retired for the evening. Those who encountered him in passing described an unremarkable man. Average height, average build, with features that failed to distinguish themselves in memory. He wasn't unfriendly exactly, but neither was he warm. He existed in that particular category of neighbor who acknowledges your presence with a brief nod but never initiates conversation, who maintains his property just well enough to avoid complaint but shows no particular pride in it, who seems to prefer the solitude of his own company to the casual socializing that happened over hedges and mailboxes. The texture of daily life in these neighborhoods followed predictable patterns. Children rode bicycles in widening circles of independence as parents gradually relaxed their supervision, trusting in the assumed safety of familiar streets. Women, and it was still predominantly women in that time and place, managed households and part-time work, organizing carpools and keeping mental catalogs of which kids belonged to which families. Men commuted to offices and industrial sites, their departures and returns marking the beginning and end of each workday with a regularity that felt reassuring in its predictability. The local news occasionally reported crime, but it seemed to happen elsewhere in other parts of the city, among people who made different choices and lived different lives. September 1980 arrived with the oppressive heat that characterizes late summer in southeast Texas, the kind of weather that makes air conditioning not a luxury but a necessity, that drives people indoors and makes the evening hours precious for any outdoor activity. School had recently resumed, re-establishing routines that had relaxed over the summer months. Families were settling back into the rhythm of homework and early bedtimes, of weekend football games and Sunday dinners. Nothing in the atmosphere suggested that this September would be different from any other, that it would be remembered as a dividing line between before and after. Sharon DeVilliers was 18 years old that September, standing at the threshold of adulthood with all the uncertainty and possibility that position entails. She worked at a convenience store, one of those positions that filled the gap between high school and whatever came next. Community college, perhaps, or a different job with better hours and higher pay. Her shifts often ended late, requiring her to make the journey home after dark, navigating streets that were familiar enough during daylight but took on a different character under the harsh orange glow of street lamps. She was the kind of young woman you'd find in any American suburb in 1980, not running from anything or toward anything in particular, simply occupying the ordinary space of young adulthood, making small decisions that seemed unremarkable at the time but that, in retrospect, would come to carry enormous weight. On the night of September 11th, 1980, Sharon finished her shift at the convenience store and began the journey back to the apartment she shared with her boyfriend. The route was one she'd traveled many times before, familiar enough that she likely paid little attention to most of the landmarks along the way. But somewhere during that routine journey, something happened that would transform an ordinary Thursday night into something else entirely. The exact sequence of events, how she encountered Stephen McCoy, what words might have been exchanged, what caused her to enter a vehicle with him, would later become subjects of investigation and testimony, pieced together from evidence and confession rather than direct witness. What is known with certainty is that Sharon DeVilliers did not arrive home that night. As hours passed and her absence extended beyond what could be explained by ordinary circumstances, concern grew into alarm. Her boyfriend, waiting at their apartment, watching the clock advance through the night, began making phone calls. Friends and family were contacted, their own worry amplifying as they confirmed they hadn't seen her, hadn't heard from her. By the following morning, when she still hadn't appeared and couldn't be reached, a missing person report was filed with local authorities. The investigation that followed operated according to the protocols of the time. Officers interviewed co-workers who had seen her at the convenience store, reconstructed her likely route home, canvassed neighborhoods for witnesses who might have noticed something unusual. In an era before widespread surveillance cameras, before cell phones that could track locations and preserve final communications, investigators relied on physical evidence, witness statements, and the painstaking work of building a timeline from fragments of information. Days passed with no significant leads, no sightings, no evidence of where Sharon might have gone or what might have happened to her. Then, on September 14th, 3 days after she was last seen alive, Sharon DeVilliers' body was discovered in a field in northwestern Harris County. The location was not random. It had been deliberately chosen, remote enough to avoid immediate discovery but not so isolated as to be impossible to access. The condition of her body told investigators that she had been the victim of extreme violence, that she had suffered before death, that whoever had done this had acted with both brutality and an apparent lack of remorse. The medical examiner's findings would later confirm that she had been sexually assaulted and strangled, that her death had likely occurred within hours of her disappearance. The discovery transformed the investigation from a missing person case into a homicide, bringing additional resources and renewed urgency. Detectives worked to establish a timeline, to identify anyone who might have seen Sharon during her final hours, to find physical evidence that could point toward her killer. The community, learning of the murder through local news reports, experienced the particular kind of fear that comes from violence without explanation, from knowing that someone capable of such acts was still among them. The investigation into Sharon DeVilliers' death consumed the attention of the Harris County Sheriff's Department through the remainder of September and into October 1980. Detectives followed leads that ranged from promising to improbable, interviewed individuals whose connection to the victim was sometimes tangential at best, and worked to build a profile of who might be capable of such violence. The physical evidence collected from the scene was processed according to the forensic capabilities of the time. No DNA analysis existed yet to identify suspects from biological material, making investigators reliant on fingerprints, witness descriptions, and circumstantial connections. The neighborhood where Sharon had lived and worked continued its daily routines, but beneath the surface normalcy, anxiety had taken root. Parents who had previously allowed teenagers relative freedom now insisted on knowing exact whereabouts and return times. Women who had thought nothing of walking alone after dark began seeking companions or altering their routes to stay within more populated areas. The local convenience stores and gas stations that depended on evening customers noticed the change. Fewer people willing to stop after sunset, more locked car doors, and quick transactions. Stephen McCoy, during this time, maintained his unremarkable existence. He went to work, returned home, moved through public spaces without attracting particular notice. Nothing in his demeanor suggested a man carrying the weight of what he had done. No obvious sign of guilt or anxiety that might have drawn attention. This ability to compartmentalize, to continue functioning in ordinary social contexts while harboring extraordinary secrets, would later become a point of psychological examination, an attempt to understand how someone could exist simultaneously as both the perpetrator of extreme violence and a seemingly normal member of society. But whatever control McCoy exercised over his impulses proved temporary. On November 2, 1980, less than 2 months after Sharon DeVilliers' murder, another young woman disappeared under circumstances that would prove terrifyingly similar. Dorothy Duran, who at 25 was slightly older than Sharon but occupied a comparable social position, worked at a gas station and lived a life that intersected with public spaces and late-night hours. On the evening of November 2nd, she finished her shift and, like Sharon before her, began a journey home that she would never complete. The parallels between the two disappearances were not immediately apparent to investigators. Different jurisdictions sometimes meant different investigators, different filing systems, different levels of communication between agencies. The Houston metropolitan area was large enough and crime rates high enough that missing person reports didn't always receive immediate cross-referencing. But as hours turned to days and Dorothy Duran failed to appear, those who were searching for her began to notice the similarities. Both women were young, both worked evening shifts at service stations, both had vanished during what should have been routine trips home. Dorothy's body was discovered on November 4th in a wooded area in northern Harris County, the location chosen with the same apparent deliberateness that had characterized Sharon's disposal. The cause of death, the evidence of sexual assault, the method of killing, all bore unmistakable similarities to the earlier murder. What had been one horrific crime now revealed itself as something potentially worse. A pattern, suggesting not an isolated act of violence but a predator who was hunting. The investigation intensified with this second murder. Task forces were assembled, bringing together detectives from different departments to share information and coordinate efforts. The media began reporting on what appeared to be a serial killer operating in Harris County, generating both public awareness and public fear. The coverage was extensive enough that people began connecting the cases on their own, sharing information and suspicions, creating informal networks of concern that operated alongside official investigative channels. Detectives working the cases looked for connections between the victims beyond the obvious similarities of their circumstances. Had they known each other, frequented the same places, encountered the same people in the days before their deaths? The investigation produced a web of potential links, some meaningful and others merely coincidental. What became increasingly clear was that whoever was responsible was familiar with the area, comfortable navigating the geography of Harris County's sprawling suburban landscape, capable of identifying vulnerable targets and exploiting opportunities. Physical evidence from both crime scenes underwent comparative analysis. Investigators hoped to find something definitive, matching fingerprints, tire tracks, fibers, anything that could provide a concrete link to a suspect. The forensic work was meticulous but limited by the technology available. Without the genetic analysis that would become standard in later decades, much of the microscopic evidence could suggest similarities but couldn't definitively identify individuals. Witness interviews expanded to include anyone who might have been in the vicinity of either victim's last known locations. Service station employees, convenience store customers, drivers who regularly traveled the relevant routes. All were questioned about whether they had noticed anyone suspicious, any vehicles that appeared repeatedly, any behavior that seemed out of place. The challenge was separating the genuinely relevant information from the noise of ordinary activity, identifying the meaningful patterns from the background routine of suburban life. As November progressed without an arrest, the pressure on investigators intensified. The public wanted assurance that someone was being held accountable, that the threat had been contained. Media coverage continued, sometimes helping by generating tips, but other times hindering by spreading misinformation or creating panic disproportionate to the actual risk. Women in the area altered their behavior significantly, avoiding late-night work shifts when possible, traveling in groups, regarding unfamiliar vehicles and strangers with heightened suspicion. The break in the case came not from sophisticated forensic analysis or brilliant deductive reasoning, but from something more mundane. McCoy made a mistake. On November 12, 1980, he attempted to abduct another young woman, but this time the circumstances didn't align in his favor. The intended victim managed to escape, to get a description of both McCoy and his vehicle, to provide investigators with the concrete lead they had been seeking. The details she provided, the make and model of the car, a partial license plate number, a physical description of her attacker, finally gave the investigation a specific direction rather than just a general profile. Within days, Stephen McCoy was identified as a person of interest. His vehicle matched the description, his appearance fit the witness account, and his background check revealed nothing that would exclude him from suspicion. On November 15, 1980, officers arrived at his residence to question him about the attempted abduction. What they found there, and what McCoy would eventually reveal, would confirm what investigators had begun to suspect. That they were looking not at isolated incidents but at a series of predatory attacks by someone who had been operating undetected among them. The interrogation of Stephen McCoy began in the formal, procedurally careful manner that characterized law enforcement practices in the wake of Miranda and other judicial decisions establishing suspect rights. He was read his rights, informed of why he had been brought in for questioning, given the opportunity to request legal representation. Initially, McCoy maintained the stance of someone wrongly accused, expressing confusion about why he was being questioned, offering explanations for his whereabouts that seemed designed to establish alibis without providing too much specific detail that could be later contradicted. But as the interrogation continued, as detectives presented him with the evidence they had gathered, the witness description, the vehicle match, the timeline that placed him in proximity to the crimes, something in McCoy's demeanor began to shift. The exact mechanism of this shift, what internal calculation led him to abandon his denials, remains a matter of speculation. Perhaps he recognized that the evidence against him was mounting to an insurmountable degree. Perhaps the psychological burden of maintaining the deception became too heavy. Perhaps, as sometimes happens with individuals who commit such acts, there was an element of wanting to claim credit, to have his actions acknowledged rather than attributed to some unknown figure. What is documented is that Stephen McCoy, after hours of questioning, began to confess. Not in the dramatic, emotion-filled manner sometimes portrayed in fictional accounts, but in a methodical, almost clinical recounting of events. He described encountering Sharon de Villiers, the circumstances that led to her entering his vehicle, what had happened in the hours that followed. He provided details that only someone present could have known, information that aligned with the forensic evidence and the medical examiner's findings. Then, without being specifically asked, he began describing other incidents, other victims, revealing that the investigation had not uncovered the full scope of what he had done. The confession expanded to include Dorothy Duran, confirming what investigators had suspected about the connection between the two murders. McCoy described the same pattern: the initial encounter, the abduction, the violence, the disposal of the body in a remote location. His tone throughout remained oddly detached, as if he were describing events he had witnessed rather than perpetrated, a psychological distance that troubled the detectives conducting the interview. But the confession didn't stop there. McCoy revealed that there had been another victim, one whose disappearance and death had not yet been connected to him by investigators. Monique Stevenson, just 17 years old, had been murdered by McCoy earlier that year. Her body had been discovered, but without the clear pattern connection that would link her death to the later crimes. McCoy now claimed responsibility, providing details that would need to be verified against the existing case files and evidence. The revelation that there were potentially more victims than investigators had realized sent shock waves through the investigative team. If McCoy had killed 3 women that they knew of, how many others might there be? Had he been operating even longer than they suspected? Were there other victims whose bodies hadn't been found, whose disappearances had been attributed to runaways or other circumstances? The interrogation continued with renewed urgency, detectives pressing for any additional information while documenting everything McCoy said. The legal machinery that follows such confessions began its methodical work. District attorneys reviewed the evidence, prepared charging documents, began building the cases that would eventually be presented in court. The physical evidence was re-examined in light of McCoy's confession, looking for corroboration or contradiction. Witness statements were reviewed, timelines were refined, and the procedural chain of evidence was meticulously documented to ensure that nothing would be excluded on technical grounds. For the families of the victims, the confirmation that their loved ones had been murdered, that their deaths had been neither accident nor misfortune but deliberate acts of violence, brought a complex mixture of emotions. There was relief in finally knowing what had happened, in having the uncertainty resolved. But that relief was inseparable from the renewed grief of confronting the specific horrors their daughters had endured, of imagining their final hours, of recognizing that they had died at the hands of someone who had shown them no mercy. The community's reaction to McCoy's arrest and confession combined vindication with a different kind of anxiety. The immediate threat had been removed. McCoy was in custody and would remain so, but his presence among them, his ordinariness, his ability to move through their neighborhoods without detection, raised uncomfortable questions. How many others might be capable of similar violence? What signs had been missed? Could such tragedy have been prevented if people had paid more attention, been more vigilant, taken different precautions? Media coverage of the case intensified with the confession and the revelation of multiple victims. News reports detailed the crimes while trying to understand the man who had committed them. Neighbors were interviewed, co-workers questioned. Anyone who had interacted with McCoy asked to provide their impressions. The portrait that emerged was consistently one of ordinariness. No one reported obvious warning signs. No one described behavior that screamed danger. No one had suspected that McCoy was capable of such acts. As the legal process moved forward, McCoy was formally charged with 3 counts of capital murder. Texas law at the time made such charges potentially subject to the death penalty, and prosecutors made clear their intention to seek that ultimate punishment. The decision was not made lightly. Capital cases required extraordinary resources, demanded rigorous proof, and carried their own moral weight. But given the nature of the crimes, the number of victims, and the apparent lack of remorse, prosecutors felt the severity of the punishment was warranted. The victims' families faced the prospect of trials, of having to hear detailed testimony about what their daughters had endured, of seeing the man who had killed them in court, of participating in a process that would extend over months or potentially years. The emotional toll of such involvement is difficult to overstate. The constant reopening of wounds, the requirement to maintain composure in the face of horrific details, the uncertainty about whether justice would ultimately be served. Chapter 4: The Machinery of Justice and Its Aftermath. Stephen McCoy's trial began in 1981, conducted in the formal setting of a Harris County courtroom where the mechanisms of American criminal justice would determine his fate. The proceedings followed the established patterns of capital murder cases: jury selection designed to identify individuals capable of imposing death sentences, opening statements that outlined the prosecution's case and the defense's strategy, the methodical presentation of evidence and testimony that would fill days of court time. The prosecution's case rested heavily on McCoy's confession, supported by the physical evidence that corroborated his account. Forensic experts testified about the causes of death, the timeline of events, the locations where the bodies had been found. The attempted abduction victim, whose escape had ultimately led to McCoy's identification, provided her testimony about the encounter, describing his vehicle, his appearance, his behavior during those frightening moments. Investigators detailed the work that had gone into solving the crimes, connecting the evidence to the defendants seated at the defense table. The defense, tasked with the unenviable position of representing someone who had confessed to multiple murders, focused on mitigating factors rather than disputing guilt. Mental health experts were called to testify about McCoy's psychological state, his capacity for understanding the wrongfulness of his actions, any factors that might explain though not excuse his behavior. The strategy was not to argue innocence but to argue against the death penalty, to convince the jury that life imprisonment rather than execution was the appropriate sentence. The jury, after hearing all the evidence and receiving instructions on the law, deliberated on both guilt and punishment. The verdict, when it came, surprised no one who had followed the trial: guilty on all counts. The sentence that followed reflected the severity of the crimes and the jury's conclusion that mitigating factors did not outweigh the aggravating circumstances. Death by lethal injection. The sentence triggered an automatic appeals process, standard in capital cases and designed to ensure that no one is executed without multiple levels of judicial review. McCoy's case would be examined by appellate courts, his conviction and sentence scrutinized for legal errors, constitutional violations, or procedural irregularities. The appeals would extend over years, during which McCoy would remain on death row in Texas's correctional system, existing in the limbo state of awaiting an execution date that might be scheduled and then postponed multiple times. For the families of Sharon DeVilliers, Dorothy Duran, and Monique Stevenson, the conviction and death sentence brought a measure of closure, though that term inadequately captures the complex reality of losing a loved one to violence. Justice had been served in the legal sense. The perpetrator had been identified, tried, and sentenced, but no legal outcome could restore what had been taken from them. They would continue to live with the absence of daughters and sisters who should have had full lives ahead of them, whose futures had been stolen not by accident or illness but by deliberate human cruelty. The years that followed saw McCoy's appeals work their way through the judicial system. Each level of review examined different aspects of the case. Whether his confession had been properly obtained, whether the trial had been fairly conducted, whether the sentence was proportionate to the crimes. Defense attorneys, even for clients as seemingly indefensible as McCoy, performed their ethical duty to ensure that constitutional rights were protected and that the legal process had functioned as intended. On May 18, 1989, after years of appeals and judicial review, Stephen McCoy was executed by lethal injection at the Texas Department of Criminal Justice Huntsville Unit. He was among the earlier individuals to be executed after Texas resumed capital punishment in the modern era, part of a wave of executions that would make Texas the most active death penalty state in the nation. His final statement, if there was one, has not been widely reported or preserved in public records. His death marked the legal conclusion to a case that had begun nearly 9 years earlier with Sharon de Villiers' disappearance. The execution of Stephen McCoy did not end the questions his crimes raised, nor did it provide complete peace to those affected. The families of his victims had to decide for themselves whether witnessing his execution brought any sense of resolution or whether it simply represented another chapter in a tragedy that would never fully close. Some victims' family members find that executions provide a definitive end, a final accounting that confirms justice was done. Others discover that witnessing an execution leaves them feeling empty, that the death of the perpetrator doesn't restore what was lost or ease the ongoing burden of grief. The broader questions McCoy's case raised about violence, predation, and community safety remained unresolved. How do societies protect vulnerable individuals from predators who blend seamlessly into ordinary life? What signs might indicate danger, and how can communities become better at recognizing those signs without descending into paranoia? How should we balance the rights of individuals to privacy and freedom of movement with the collective need for safety? The case also highlighted the particular vulnerabilities of young women working late-night shifts in service industries, a pattern that has been recognized in numerous other criminal cases. The economics that push people into such positions, the limited alternatives available, the normalization of risk as simply part of the job, all these factors create opportunities for predators and reduce the social protections that might otherwise exist. From a criminal justice perspective, the McCoy case demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of the investigative process. The successful resolution depended significantly on McCoy's own error, the attempted abduction that didn't succeed, rather than purely on investigative brilliance. Without that failed attempt, without the witness who escaped and could provide a description, the investigation might have continued far longer, potentially allowing McCoy to claim additional victims. This raises questions about how many similar predators might be operating undetected, their crimes attributed to other causes or remaining unsolved. The forensic science available in 1980 was vastly inferior to what exists today. DNA analysis, digital surveillance, cell phone tracking, and other modern investigative tools might have identified McCoy more quickly or prevented him from claiming multiple victims. Yet even with all our technological advances, predatory individuals continue to exploit vulnerabilities, suggesting that technology alone cannot solve the problem of interpersonal violence. The case remains in the records of Harris County, a documented instance of violence and its legal resolution that tells us something about both the capacity for human cruelty and the societal mechanisms we've created to respond to it. For students of criminal justice, it offers lessons about investigative procedures, confession interrogation, and capital punishment. For those interested in psychology, it raises questions about what enables someone to commit such acts, what distinguishes those who act on violent impulses from those who do not. But perhaps most importantly, the case reminds us that behind every crime statistic, every case number, every legal proceeding, there are human beings whose lives were cut short and families whose grief continues. Sharon de Villiers, Dorothy Duran, and Monique Stevenson were not merely victims in a criminal case, but individuals with their own dreams, relationships, and futures that should have unfolded. Their deaths diminished not just their immediate families, but the broader community, depriving the world of whatever contributions they might have made, whatever joy they might have experienced and shared. The neighborhoods where these events occurred have changed in the decades since 1980. New families have moved in. Children who weren't born when McCoy committed his crimes are now adults with children of their own, and the physical landscape has been transformed by development and time. But memory persists in different forms. In the families who still carry their loss, in the archived newspaper articles that documented the crimes and trial, in the court records that preserve the legal proceedings for anyone who cares to examine them. We tell these stories not to sensationalize violence or to satisfy morbid curiosity, but to remember that such things have happened and can happen, to honor those whose lives were taken, and to remind ourselves of the constant, quiet work required to maintain the fragile social bonds that keep most of us safe most of the time. Stephen McCoy's ordinariness, his ability to exist among others without revealing his capacity for violence, should unsettle us precisely because it demonstrates that danger doesn't always announce itself, that we cannot always distinguish the harmless from the harmful by simple observation. The case stands as a testament to the fact that justice, when it works, requires the combined efforts of many people. Investigators who piece together evidence, prosecutors who present cases, jurors who weigh facts, judges who ensure fair process, and appellate courts that review for errors. It also stands as a reminder of justice's limitations, that even perfect legal proceedings cannot undo harm, cannot restore life, cannot fully satisfy the human need for meaning in the face of senseless violence. In the end, we're left with the same uncomfortable truths that have always existed. That evil, if we choose to use that word, can wear ordinary faces, that vulnerability is part of the human condition, that the mechanisms we've created to protect and to punish are imperfect but necessary tools. And we're left with the memory of 3 young women who deserved better than they received, whose absence continues to echo through the lives of those who loved them, whose stories deserve to be told not for the horror of how they died, but for the recognition that they lived. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe, so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4, The Parole Board's Ghost. There's a folder that sits in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice archives, stamped with a case number that prison officials came to recognize with a particular kind of dread. Inside are parole hearing transcripts from 1989, recommendations typed on department letterhead, signatures of board members who believed in second chances, in rehabilitation, in the possibility of redemption. These documents authorized the release of a man who had already taken 3 lives. Within 3 years of walking free, he would take at least 9 more. The folder represents something more troubling than a single administrative decision. It stands as evidence of a question that still echoes through criminal justice systems everywhere. How do we measure the weight of a human life against the promise of change? And what happens when we get the answer catastrophically wrong? This is the story of Kenneth McDuff, a man whose very existence became an argument against mercy, and the dozen families who paid the price for someone else's faith in his reformation. The landscape of Central Texas in the 1960s stretched out in contradictions. Rosebud, a town of barely 1,000 souls, sat tucked between cotton fields and cattle ranches where tradition ran deeper than the Brazos River. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where church on Sunday wasn't optional, and where certain families held their position through generations of careful reputation management. The McDuff family occupied an unusual space in this social order. They weren't wealthy, but they weren't poor either. They owned property. They had business interests. Kenneth Allen McDuff, born in 1946, grew up in a household where his mother Addie's devotion bordered on something psychology textbooks would later categorize as pathological enabling. From childhood, Kenneth exhibited behaviors that should have raised alarms. He tortured animals with a methodical cruelty that disturbed even other children in rural areas where hunting and livestock management were ordinary parts of life. There's a difference between a farm boy learning to slaughter chickens and a child who takes pleasure in prolonging suffering. Kenneth understood this difference intimately. He was a bully of uncommon persistence, targeting smaller children with a creativity in torment that suggested something fundamentally disconnected in his capacity for empathy. Teachers noted his explosive temper. Neighbors whispered about things that went missing, about confrontations that escalated beyond normal teenage posturing. But Addie McDuff defended her son with a ferociousness that made intervention nearly impossible. Every complaint was dismissed. Every accuser was maligned. Every warning was ignored. By his late teens, Kenneth had accumulated a criminal record that read like a catalog of escalating antisocial behavior. Burglary, assault, theft. Each arrest brought the same response from his mother: outrage at the accusers, excuses for her son, and often enough financial resources to minimize consequences. The pattern established itself early and deeply. Kenneth learned that actions had no permanent consequences, that his mother's protection was absolute, that the world would bend around his impulses if he simply waited for her to apply enough pressure. It was a devastating education in accountability's absence. The summer of 1966 brought an end to this cycle of minor crimes and maternal rescue. On August 6th, 3 teenagers were driving along a rural road near Everman, Texas, when Kenneth McDuff and his accomplice Roy Dale Green forced them off the pavement. What happened in the hours that followed would become one of the most brutal crimes in Texas history. Robert Brand, 17 years old, and his cousin Mark Dunham, 16, were shot execution-style in the back of the head and stuffed into the trunk of their own car. Edna Sullivan, 16, endured horrors that the trial transcripts describe in clinical legal language that somehow makes the reality more sickening than graphic detail ever could. Her body was found in a field, evidence of prolonged torture marking her final hours. She had fought. The autopsy revealed that much. She had fought until fighting became impossible. Roy Dale Green, 19 years old and terrified of what he'd witnessed, turned state's evidence. His testimony provided the prosecution with a minutely detailed account of Kenneth McDuff's actions, his statements, his complete lack of remorse during and after the murders. The trial in 1968 was swift by modern standards. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty. The judge sentenced Kenneth McDuff to death. Texas still had the electric chair, though it wouldn't be used on him. He joined death row in Huntsville, another young man in a cell waiting for a date with state-sanctioned execution, just one more monster among many. But Texas, like much of America, was experiencing a profound shift in how it thought about capital punishment. Legal challenges were mounting. Constitutional questions were being raised about whether execution constituted cruel and unusual punishment. In 1972, the Supreme Court's decision in Furman v. Georgia effectively invalidated all existing death penalty statutes across the country. Sentences were commuted. Death rows were emptied into general population. Kenneth McDuff's sentence was reduced to life imprisonment. It should have meant the rest of his natural life behind bars. A man in his 20s locked away from society until age and prison took him. It should have been the end of his story. Instead, it was merely an intermission. Prison officials noted his behavior with growing concern. He wasn't reformed. He wasn't repentant. He served his time with the same manipulative intelligence that had characterized his youth, avoiding serious infractions while radiating menace to those who understood what they were seeing. Other inmates learned to avoid him. Guards recognized him as a predator contained but unchanged. The psychological evaluations piled up over the years, each one painting essentially the same picture. A man fundamentally incapable of genuine human connection, someone who viewed others purely as objects to be used or destroyed according to his needs. Yet somehow, incredibly, as Texas prisons filled past capacity in the late 1980s, as budget pressures mounted and lawmakers demanded solutions to overcrowding, Kenneth McDuff's name began appearing on lists of potential parole candidates. The parole hearing that would doom at least 9 people lasted less than an hour. Kenneth McDuff sat before the board with 2 decades of imprisonment behind him, his mother Addie beside him as always, her testimony a familiar song of maternal certainty in her son's transformation. She spoke of his remorse, though prison records documented none. She described his plans for honest work, though he had never held legitimate employment for more than weeks at a time. She promised her supervision, as if her lifetime of enabling had suddenly reversed into responsibility. The board members had before them the same files the guards and psychologists had reviewed. They had access to the trial transcripts, to the nature of his crimes, to expert opinions warning that McDuff represented an ongoing danger. They released him anyway. October 11, 1989. Kenneth McDuff walked out of prison at 43 years old, supposedly rehabilitated, officially pardoned by a system too overwhelmed to maintain appropriate oversight of the truly dangerous. He moved into his parents' home in Rosebud, and for a brief period, maintained enough of a facade to avoid immediate reincarceration. He enrolled at Texas State Technical College in Waco, using federal financial aid programs designed to help former prisoners reintegrate into society. He attended classes, he worked occasional jobs, and he began hunting again, this time with the accumulated patience of a predator who'd learned to wait for the perfect moment. The Waco area in the early 1990s was struggling with problems that created perfect conditions for someone like McDuff. The crack cocaine epidemic had taken hold, creating a population of vulnerable young women whose disappearances might not trigger immediate alarm. Sex workers, addicts, women living on society's margins. They moved in and out of visibility in ways that delayed recognition when they vanished. McDuff understood this instinctively. He frequented the areas where these women worked, driving his pickup truck through certain neighborhoods with the regularity of someone shopping for merchandise. He presented himself as a customer, sometimes friendly, always watching for opportunity. For women desperate enough, the risk of getting into a stranger's vehicle was just another calculation in a life full of dangerous mathematics. Seraphia Parker disappeared on October 10, 1991, 2 years almost to the day after McDuff's release. She was 24 years old, working the streets to support an addiction that had taken over her life. Witnesses saw her get into a truck matching McDuff's vehicle. She was never seen alive again. Her body would not be found for months, and when it was discovered, identification took time that McDuff used to continue hunting. The tragedy compounded itself in the gap between her disappearance and the recognition that a pattern was forming. Each day that passed without alarm was another day for McDuff to operate freely. Valencia Joshua vanished in February 1992. 22 years old, she too had been struggling with addiction, trying to survive in a world that had narrowed to the next high, the next $20, the next dangerous decision. Someone saw her near the convenience store where McDuff was known to buy beer and cigars. The witness couldn't be certain, the memory was vague, and by the time police began asking questions with real urgency, weeks had passed. Then Regina Moore disappeared at the end of February. 29 years old, last seen in an area McDuff frequented. The women were vanishing like smoke, and the communities they came from, already marginalized, already accustomed to indifference from authorities, struggled to make anyone understand that something systematic was happening. The case that finally broke everything open came on March 1, 1992. Melissa Ann Northrup was 22 years old, pregnant, working at a car wash in Waco to support herself and her children. She wasn't part of the street population McDuff had been targeting. She was a young mother with a job and a family and plans for her future. Her disappearance from a public place in broad daylight triggered an immediate and intense investigation that the earlier cases had not received. Witnesses had seen her talking to a customer. They provided descriptions. They remembered details about a truck. The police began assembling a picture, and that picture increasingly pointed toward Kenneth Allen McDuff, the paroled triple murderer living in their community. But McDuff had already recognized the increased attention. He fled Waco, using money stolen from a victim to fund his flight. He drove to Kansas City, where he worked under an assumed name in a waste collection company, just another anonymous employee in a city that didn't know his face or history. Police in Texas issued warrants. They contacted federal authorities. The case became a multi-state manhunt, but for weeks McDuff remained free, working his job, living in a cheap motel, probably believing he could simply vanish into America's vast anonymous landscape the way so many fugitives had before him. What McDuff hadn't anticipated was America's Most Wanted, the television program that had become remarkably effective at generating tips from a nationwide audience. On May 4, 1992, his face appeared on screens across the country. The story of the paroled killer who'd returned to murder was exactly the kind of case that galvanized public attention. Within hours, the tips began flooding in. A coworker in Kansas City recognized him. Local police surrounded his motel. Kenneth McDuff was arrested without incident, sitting in his room watching television, perhaps the very program that had exposed him. He was extradited back to Texas, where investigators began the grim process of connecting him to a growing list of missing and murdered women. The interrogations revealed a mind utterly devoid of conscience. McDuff spoke about his victims the way someone might discuss discarded trash, annoyed that their discovery had created problems for him rather than demonstrating any recognition of their humanity. Detectives who had interviewed hundreds of criminals over their careers later described a particular quality to McDuff's callousness that stood apart from even other killers. It wasn't that he gloried in the violence or felt compelled to explain himself. He simply didn't register that what he'd done mattered in any moral sense. The young women he'd murdered were objects to him, obstacles he'd removed, nothing more. The investigation expanded across central Texas as authorities tried to account for every one of McDuff's victims. Colleen Reed, a 28-year-old accountant, had been abducted from an Austin car wash in December 1991. Witnesses had seen the kidnapping, watched in horror as a man forced her into a vehicle while an accomplice drove. It took months to connect McDuff definitively to this crime, months during which other women continued to disappear. When the evidence finally solidified, it revealed the same pattern. A woman alone, a public location that became isolated at the crucial moment, overwhelming force, and then nothing but absence. Bodies began to surface as investigators searched areas McDuff had frequented. Brenda Thompson's remains were found in a field in September 1992. She had been 21 years old when she vanished. The condition of her body, the circumstances of the dump site, the ligature marks, all of it pointed to prolonged captivity before death. The forensic evidence painted pictures that the investigators had to carry with them, scenes they couldn't unsee, knowledge that would haunt them for years. Each discovery brought a measure of closure to families who had been existing in the terrible limbo of not knowing, but it also brought the crushing weight of confirmation that their worst fears had been true. The prosecutor's office in McLennan County began assembling the capital murder case against McDuff for the death of Melissa Ann Northrup. Her body had been discovered in a gravel pit in Dallas County on April 26, 1992, before McDuff's arrest. The autopsy revealed she had been alive when thrown into the water, had drowned while bound and helpless. The physical evidence connected McDuff to the crime scene. Witnesses placed him with the victim. His own statements, carefully parsed for admissible content, provided additional confirmation. The prosecution had everything they needed to seek death again, and this time there would be no legal technicality to save him. The trial in 1993 became a moment of reckoning not just for McDuff but for the parole system that had released him. Families of the victims testified about their losses, about the holes torn in their lives that would never heal. Addie McDuff attended daily, still defending her son, still insisting on his innocence despite mountains of evidence and his own incriminating statements. The jury heard about the 1966 murders, admitted as evidence of pattern and character. They learned about the parole decision, about the warnings ignored, about the systematic failures that had turned McDuff loose on an unsuspecting community. The defense offered little beyond technicalities and procedure. There was no real argument for innocence, no plausible alternative explanation. The evidence was simply too overwhelming, too carefully documented, too thoroughly corroborated. After deliberating for less than a day, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. The punishment phase took even less time. Kenneth McDuff was sentenced to death, a sentence that would now be carried out under Texas's reformed capital punishment statute. There would be no commutation this time, no constitutional reversal, no technicality to exploit. The state had learned its lesson about letting monsters slip through procedural cracks. Additional trials followed for other victims as prosecutors worked to ensure that every case received judicial attention, that every family had their day in court. McDuff was convicted in the death of Colleen Reed in a separate trial, then convicted again for Brenda Thompson's murder. Each verdict added a layer of legal certainty, redundancy against the possibility of appeal or reversal. The cases for the other victims, Valencia Joshua, Regina Moore, Seraphia Parker, and several others whose connections to McDuff seemed clear but whose cases presented evidentiary challenges, remained officially open, though investigators had little doubt about who was responsible. On November 17, 1998, Kenneth Allen McDuff was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. He was 52 years old. He had spent 6 years on death row, time consumed by automatic appeals that went nowhere, clemency petitions that were summarily denied, and legal maneuvers that everyone involved understood were merely procedural formality. The victims' families attended the execution, some seeking closure, others simply wanting to witness the definitive end of the man who had destroyed their lives. Macduff's final statement was brief and characteristically devoid of genuine remorse. He acknowledged nothing, apologized for nothing, took responsibility for nothing. He died as he had lived, a void where empathy should have been. But Macduff's death didn't close the questions his case opened. The most troubling of these centered on the parole board decision that had freed him in 1989. How had multiple board members looked at a triple murderer's file? Someone who had tortured and killed teenagers, who had shown no remorse, who had been evaluated by psychologists as a continuing danger, and decided he deserved release? The answer proved to be a combination of factors that revealed systemic failures reaching far beyond any individual decision. Texas prisons in the late 1980s were desperately overcrowded, operating under federal court orders to reduce their populations or face intervention. The state needed to release prisoners, needed to make room, needed to show compliance with judicial mandates. At the same time, the parole board was understaffed, overworked, and processing cases at a volume that made thorough review nearly impossible. Board members spent minutes on decisions that should have taken hours. They relied on summaries rather than complete files, on recommendations from subordinates rather than personal examination of records. The pressure to approve paroles, to move cases through the system, to demonstrate progress on overcrowding, all of it created an environment where even obvious risks could be overlooked or rationalized. Macduff's case was approved alongside hundreds of others, part of a mass release program that prioritized capacity management over public safety. The political fallout was immediate and severe. Texas reformed its parole system, implementing new review procedures and standards specifically designed to prevent another Macduff. Other states examined their own practices, recognizing that the same pressures existed everywhere. The victims' families filed civil suits, seeking some measure of accountability from the system that had failed to protect their loved ones. Some of these suits were settled quietly. Others dragged on for years, legal battles that could never truly compensate for loss, but that at least forced institutions to confront their failures. For the families of women whose cases were never formally closed, the questions took a different form. Was Macduff responsible for additional murders beyond those he was convicted of? Investigators believed almost certainly yes. The timeline of his activities after his release, combined with patterns in unsolved disappearances, suggested a body count potentially much higher than the confirmed victims. But without bodies, without evidence, without the ability to prosecute a dead man, these cases remained in a legal and emotional limbo. Families knew, in the way that victims' families come to know things, but knowing without confirmation is its own particular torture. The case also sparked broader conversations about how society values certain victims over others. The early disappearances of sex workers and addicts had not triggered the same investigative response as Melissa Northrup's abduction. This wasn't unique to Macduff's case. It was and remains a pattern across jurisdictions, a reality that the families of marginalized victims understand intimately. Their loved ones are seen as less worthy of resources, less deserving of attention, their deaths treated as somehow less tragic because of the circumstances of their lives. Macduff had understood this and exploited it, targeting women whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed, whose cases might not generate urgency. In the years since the executions, Macduff has become a case study in criminal justice education, a cautionary tale about parole decisions and risk assessment. His case appears in textbooks on corrections, forensic psychology, and criminal procedure. Students learn about him as an example of what can go wrong when systems prioritize efficiency over thoroughness, when capacity concerns override safety considerations, when warning signs are ignored because acknowledging them would be inconvenient. He serves as education, but that feels like cold comfort to the families who lost daughters, sisters, mothers to a man who should never have walked free. The town of Rosebud, where Macduff grew up and where his mother continued to live until her death in 1995, still bears the weight of association with his name. It's a small community where everyone knows the history, where the Macduff property still stands as a reminder of the monster it produced, where older residents remember Kenneth as a child and wonder what intervention might have made a difference. Some believe Addie's enabling destroyed any chance her son had at developing normally. Others think Macduff was simply born wrong, that no amount of proper parenting could have changed the fundamental emptiness at his core. The truth probably lies somewhere in the intersection of nature and nurture, an unknowable combination of factors that produced a killer. The remaining questions are perhaps unanswerable. How many victims were there really? What happened in the hours between abduction and death that the survivors of his 1966 crimes hinted at but that died with the women who experienced them? Could earlier intervention in his childhood have altered the trajectory, or was he always destined for this path? These questions linger not because they have answers, but because human minds struggle with the concept of pure malevolence, with the existence of people like Kenneth Macduff who seem to operate outside the normal parameters of human conscience. What remains certain is this: a man who had already proven himself capable of monstrous acts was given freedom he should never have received. Women died because institutions failed to protect them. Families were destroyed because systemic pressures overrode common sense. And somewhere in the Texas archives, that folder still sits with its parole hearing transcripts, a paper monument to optimism that killed, to mercy extended where none was deserved, to the price paid when we gamble with evil and lose. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.